Welcome back to Train Signal. You are watching the video for Lab 2, Creating New Sites and Subnets for benandbrady.com. Let's first see what we have accomplished so far and see where we have to go. Going back to a network diagram over here, well, a diagram is getting better and better. I've been hiding stuff from you. We started with something as basic as this, and then we introduced a second switch and then made it a little bit more complicated. This is the network infrastructure summary. And finally, that's what a network looks like. We have two different networks designated with two different city names, rather state names, California and North Carolina. And the subnet for California is 200.200.201.0. For North Carolina, it is 202.0. And in the California subnet, there are two domain controllers, DC1 and DC2. In North Carolina, there is just one domain controller, DC3, and the three domain controllers can replicate with each other. We have a fourth computer. Here you're looking at the symbol of a router, but it's actually a Windows Server 2003 set up as a router that connects to both locations, namely California, that's one location, one connection over here, and North Carolina. So we have done the following so far. One of the things that we've been ignoring is we have been totally ignoring the physical layout of a network. What we have done so far is the logical creation of a domain known as benandbrady.com. In other words, we simply created a domain, which is a logical object. It's a grouping of all Active Directory objects together into one central database known as Active Directory. But we've been ignoring the fact that DC1 and DC2 actually belongs to one physical location, and DC3 actually belongs to a totally different physical location. Now, why is this so important to consider? Consider the following. Let's say that you have clients in the North Carolina location. So here you have some clients, and they would like to log on to the benandbrady.com network. Now, remember, DC1, DC2, and DC3, they all share the Active Directory database. When the client over here tries to log on to the benandbrady.com network, it would be better if they were to authenticate against the domain controller DC3. The reason for that is that DC3 is in the same location as the clients in that particular network. If they were to actually cross the WAN line and authenticate with DC1 and DC2, well, the process will take much longer, because now you have to cross the WAN link from North Carolina to California, contact either DC1 or DC2, and then authenticate. That would not be an efficient network operation. But nowhere in our setup we have specified that. We have not specified that, well, if a client is in a certain location, they should try to use services over here, whereas when a client is in the other location, they should try and use the services over here. The other thing that complicates matters a little bit also is the fact that all our computers physically at this point is in the same location, in actually one room. Forget about two different states. And we have connected all of them together by means of a switch. So everything acts like it is a LAN, but we have to get out of that thinking and act more like this is a WAN setup. So that our router over here actually is physically connected to two physical different locations, and DC1 and DC2 are in one location, DC3 happens to be in a totally separate location. So the major purpose of this video is to actually create physical sites within our domain environment. So going back over here, in this video, we're going to map the logical domain to the physical network. We're going to create what are known as new site objects. I'll define what a site is, and we'll create those objects. We'll also create what are known as subnet objects. Now remember, this is all in, we've already done the physical network, remember that. That is what we have been doing in the video so far. Now what we're going to do is create these objects known as site, subnets, and associated with the physical network. Okay, that's the next step, associate sites with subnets. Then eventually we'll designate what is known as a licensing server, so that we make sure that each location has enough licenses for both clients and servers. And then finally, after we do all that, we have to still make sure that the changes that we have made does not affect the Active Directory replication. So we're going to replicate the Active Directory between these two sites as well. Okay, so the major task in this video is to get out of that one physical location environment of thinking, and then get into two physical networks and then associate them with one logical network known as benandbrady.com. So let's get started with that. First, let us start by defining what is a site. So going on to the next screen, what is a site? In general, a site is a grouping of one or more TCP/IP subnets that defines the physical structure of a network. Now what does this mean? In our example, we had two locations. The first location was California. In the California location, we decided to use our network ID as 200.200.201.0. So this is our subnet ID. All the computers in this location will have the first three octets set at 200.200.201. In fact, DC1 is 200.200.201.1 and DC2 is 201.2 and so forth. So all the computers in this location belong to the same subnet, and hence they also belong to the same physical location, namely the same site. So a site is simply a grouping of computers that follow the same network ID. Now, in the same location, for example, in California, it is possible to have two subnets as well. I could have had a subnet 200.200.201.0 and another subnet 200.200.203.0. 202 is taken, so I choose to use 203. And then the two subnets are connected by means of a router. So just by looking at the site, just by looking at the network ID does not mean that it is associated with one site. In other words, within the same site, I can have more than one subnets. Imagine that in the California location, there are two buildings within the downtown area, and the buildings are maybe about 2 miles apart. All right, so in the first building, the network is set up as 201.0, and in the second building, the network is set up at 202.0. They both still belong to the same site because they are well connected by means of a fast network connection. So simply saying that a network ID associates a site would not be a complete definition of what a site is. In general, going back to this, a site is nothing but a geographical location of a company. A LAN is considered a site in general in any case. So for example, in a building, if you have the network cabling done at 10/100, nowadays it's mostly 100 megabits per second, it is considered a site. Okay, so just having different networks or one network within the location is not a complete definition of a site. Here's what actually constitutes a site. For all practical purposes, a geographical location is considered a site as long as all the devices in that geographical location are well connected by means of a fast network, and a fast network is defined as 10/100 megabits per second, which is nothing but our Ethernet cable. So let's take an example. So let's say in California, I have two locations, and the two locations within the California area are separated by means of a T1 line. A T1 line is about 1.5 megabits per second. Well, I actually have two sites. The first site and the second site are connected by means of 1.54 megabits per second. That's the speed of a T1 line, which is underneath the connection speed of 10/100 that defines the site. What I'm trying to get at is the following. For all practical purposes, if you have a LAN connection, and the LAN is possible by connecting your network devices by means of an Ethernet cable, and the Ethernet cable will always run at 10/100 megabits per second, then it is within the same site. However, within the same geographical location, if you have two areas connected even by a T1 line, which is considered a fast connection, it is still under 10 megabits per second, and so it is considered a second site. So in general, a site is a physical location, a geographical location that is well connected by means of a connection that is 10/100 megabits per second. Sorry about that. Now, if you look at the normal or the common connection technologies that are used to connect two locations, let's go through a list of those. Let's start with the most basic one, which is the modem. 56 kilobits per second, way underneath this. So definitely two locations that are connected by means of a modem or a telephone line are considered two different sites. What about cable and DSL? They go anywhere between 128 megabits per second to about 400 to 500 megabits per second. Once again, I'm sorry, 100 megabits per, let's do that again, 100 kilobits per second to 400 to 500 kilobits per second, not megabits. I'm sorry about that. Once again, let's correct that. The cable or the DSL goes between 128 to about 400 to 500 kilobits per second. Again, way below the threshold of 10 megabits per second, and it is considered two different sites. So if I have two locations separated by means of a DSL connection, for example, and the DSL connection speed is underneath 10 megabits per second, which it definitely will be, the two locations are considered two different sites. What about the next common connection, which is T1? Even T1 runs at 1.5 megabits per second. Two locations connected by a T1 line are considered two different sites. The next higher up is the T3 line, which is about 45 megabits per second. Now that can be considered as a LAN. Why? Because it is possible to have a LAN with a speed of 10 megabits per second. That's the old Ethernet cable. Well, T3 is 45 megabits per second. So the two sites connected by means of a T3 connection can be considered one site, even though they may be continents apart, simply because the connection between the two objects over there is considered fast. So to summarize, a site is a geographical grouping of computers and other network objects connected by means of a high-speed network link, which is 10 megabits per second or greater. So if you, in our case over here, we have two sites, one California, one North Carolina, and in the Ben and Brady Corporation, these two are connected by means of a T1 line. So the connection between California and North Carolina, let's assume, is a T1 connection, and our router is the one that's actually taking us out of here and then connecting us to the California, to the North Carolina site. So hopefully that clarified the definition of a site. And in our case, we have two locations, California and North Carolina, both connected by means of a T1 line, which is about 1.54 megabits per second. So we have two sites. Each of the two sites has a physical subnet ID. California has a network ID of 201.0. North Carolina has a subnet ID of 202.0. Okay, so just wanted to clarify before we go on so that the concept of a site is absolutely clear to you. Now, what do we have? We have a domain, which is benandbrady.com, and then we have the physical subnets 201.0, 202.0. Now is the time to link the two together by creating what are known as connection objects. So what we need to do is go to Active Directory sites and services and do the following. It's a four-step process. The first step is to actually create a site. Yes, we do have two sites, but a domain does not know that. So we'll be going to Active Directory sites and services and creating two sites, California and North Carolina. The second thing to do is create what is known as a subnet. Once again, we have a subnet in the physical network connections. The Active Directory is not aware of any subnet that exists. So we'll be creating a subnet object, again, two subnet objects, and then associating the California site with the 201.0 subnet and the North Carolina site with a 202.0 subnet. And then what we will do is move the right domain controller to the right site. At this point, you will notice that all three domain controllers are in the default site that was set up. In fact, you saw that in the previous video. And last but not the least, we'll designate a site license server. So let's get started with that. The first object of the day now is to create a new site object, and we will use Active Directory sites and services for this. So I'm going to minimize the screen, and this was my recording station. So let's go to domain controller 1, which is right over here, and I'm going to log into DC1. Alrighty, so that we are all okay with this, we are in DC1, and here's the IP for DC1. Now what I'm going to do is take you to the tool called Active Directory Sites and Services. This tool also is in the admin tools location over here, and then we'll pick up this tool called Active Directory Sites and Services. You've used this tool before, but this is the time I'm going to formally introduce this tool to you. What happens is the following. I'm going to minimize all this because we had expanded it last time. When you create the first domain controller, by default it creates a site and it calls it the default first site name. In our answer file, we call it default first site, and hence the name that you see over here. Now in that site, what it does is each domain controller that is added to that domain is automatically entered to that site, because we have not physically separated one site from another at this point. So what happened was, as each domain controller was added to the benandbrady.com network, it created a server object for that domain controller under the servers link over here. And in that server object, you have what is known as NTDS, NT Directory Services Settings. And in that settings, there is a concept known as, or a process known as KCC, Knowledge Consistency Checker. The object of this technology, or this process, is to make sure that each of the domain controllers is well connected with the other domain controller, so that in the event if any one of them is down, you will still be able to replicate with the other. So what it did was the following. I'm in the NTDS settings for the object called DC1. Over here, as you can see, the knowledge consistency checker, KCC, has created two connection objects automatically for us. It has created a connection from DC1 to DC3 and from DC1 to DC2. If I were to right click on this and say replicate now, what I've just did was replicated from server DC3 to DC1. Okay, and then if you go to the NTDS settings for all the other domain controllers, you will find the listing for the other two domain controllers right over here. So far our network is in sync. And this is very important. Every time you create additional domain controllers in your domain, make sure you go over here in sites and make sure that KCC automatically generated these connection objects so that you don't have to do this manually yourself. This is also a good indication that things worked out exactly as you planned. If you find one of them is missing, all you have to do is right click over here and then create a new connection object, and then we'll do this in a different video, and basically create it manually yourself and the list will appear over here. But typically you should not have to do that. The fact that you're creating a KCC object is because something did not go through properly. There was some interruption in the connectivity of these domain controllers which prevented it from happening. Also, if you were to see that one of these is missing, I would not go ahead and create a connection object immediately. What I would do is shut down all the domain controllers, and then in the right order, namely first start DC1, give it some time, then start DC2, give it some time, and then start DC3. And you will notice that the 3 domain controllers will try to run the KCC on each of them and then establish these connection objects automatically. So a little tour of the Active Directory sites and services, and what we observe over here is that all of our domain controllers have gone to the default site known as the default first site. So what we need to do first is create an additional site, and then this one is already created. All I have to do is change the name from default first site to California. So let's do that. I'm going to right click on this and then over here say rename, and then call this one CA for California. So one of the sites is already created, namely California. Now I need to create a second site known as North Carolina. To do that, you need to click on the sites link over here, right click, new, actually you see it over here also, but new site, and then over here let's give it the name of the site. This would be North Carolina, NC for short, and then you need to select what is known as a transport mechanism. There are 2 of them, IP and SMTP, and I'll be going through this in the next video. So let's select, there's only one connection mechanism at this point, which is IP. I'm going to click on OK, and it has now it is basically reminding us of the steps that we need to do. Let's go back over here. See this? Create a site, create a subnet and associated with site and so forth. It is reminding us of the same process. Site NC has been created. To finish configuration of NC, ensure that NC is linked to other sites, make sure there are subnets, and then associate or move domain controllers from other sites to this particular site. And we'll be doing that soon. So what I've shown you so far is the following: how to rename a site because it was already created, and then I showed you how to create a new site. Now, here is the other issue that we need to address right away. Under California, there's a link called domain controllers, and so is a link called servers under, I'm sorry, not domain controllers, servers, under which is a listing of domain controllers. Under North Carolina also, there is a link called servers. Now, if you look at our diagram, you see the mismatch right over here. Our benandbrady.com domain does not know of the following. All 3 domain controllers, DC1, DC2, DC3, are showing up under the same site, California. Now what will happen is the following. When a client in North Carolina tries to log in, it will not distinguish between DC1, DC2, and DC3. It will try to establish a connection with whoever it can, maybe DC1, maybe DC2, and then try to log in. We do not want that to happen. What we want to happen is that all the objects over here, all the network components over here should authenticate against DC3. So what we need to do is move DC3 away from the California site and then put it in the North Carolina site. That's very easy to do. So you simply pick up DC3, right click, and then say move. It will ask us which site do you want to move it to. We will say that let's put this in the North Carolina site. Click on OK. And now if I were to go over here, I have DC3 under North Carolina, and DC1 and DC2 is under California. So far so good. Our network is looking like the way it should be physically, as well as in the Active Directory sites and services. Now, also remember, we've been calling it the 201 network and the 202 network. Active Directory is still not aware of that. We have to make it aware that there are actually 2 subnets. And if I were to go over here, see, this is where the subnets are listed. By default, just because you create 2 different networks physically, it does not create the objects for those subnets right here in Active Directory sites and services. So the next task is to actually create those subnet objects. So going back to our checklist over here, we created a site. And now what we have to do is create a subnet and associate the site with it. What we also did after we created the site was to move the domain controllers in the right site. So the next task is to create a subnet and then associate the site with that subnet. So let's do that. Going back to DC1 over here. What I'm going to do is create the first subnet, and to do that what you need to do is right click, new subnet, and then over here you need to give it the network ID. In our case it's going to be 200.200.201.0, and the subnet mask is going to be 255.255.255.0, and here's a /24 that it put up. Now we can do both at the same time. You're creating a new subnet, and right over here you can also select a site object for this subnet. 201 subnet is associated with California. So just be very careful over here. Make sure that 201 is mapped to California. Click on OK, and we're done. So we just have one subnet. Now we need to create our second subnet. So let's do that. We'll right click on this, follow the same steps, subnet. This time it will be 200.200.202.0, and then 255.255.0. This will be associated with North Carolina. Did you notice, even though we created a subnet over here, California is still available, because in our definition of sites and subnets, we said that within the same location, California, it is possible to have two different subnets. The reason why you may have two different subnets is simply because these subnets may not be connected by a fast 10 megabits per second or higher network connection. So I'm going to associate this with North Carolina, click on OK, and we have successfully created our subnet objects and then associated them with the right sites. So going back to our points over here, the first one is create a site, create a subnet, associated the site with the subnet. We already created or moved the domain controller object into the site, and basically that was about it. The last thing we have to do is designate a site license server for the site. So now let's designate a site license server for each of the sites. So what you're going to do is the following. I'm going to go back to DC1, and this again is a very easy step. What you need to do is click on the site object. The site object for California is this particular one. Now on the right hand side you will see this object known as licensing site settings. What this object does is the following. It basically verifies how many domain controllers, how many servers, and how many clients you have at each location, and it contacts the licensing service for a certain domain controller to verify that there is enough licenses on that particular location for the number of computers and servers that you've set up. So it's a good verification tool. I'm going to click on the properties over here. I'm sorry, let's do it again. Went too quick over there. Right click on licensing site settings, click on properties, and then over here what you're saying is that for this particular location, California, who's going to be my site license server. So in our case over here there's nothing listed. We're going to click on the change button, and then we're going to select DC1 to be the site license server. I'm going to click on check names, click on OK, and then click on apply and OK one more time. What we have done is designated DC1 to be the site license server for California site. In a similar way, we're going to designate DC3 as a site license server for the North Carolina site. So I'm going to pick up DC3 over here, click on check names, click on OK, apply, done. Okay, so here we go. Very easy. Create a site, create a subnet, associate a subnet with that site, and then create or move. You should not, I don't think it's a good idea to create, even though you can physically actually create a domain controller object. Let me show you how to do that, and we'll delete it. Let's say that there was an additional domain controller over here, and it is not listed. So what you can do is you can right click on this, say new server, and actually create a server object. And once you create a server object, let me call it over here dummy. It actually appears in the listing over here. Now physically we don't actually have that server, so I'm going to delete it. And the reason I said you should never create one is because if you have done a good job installing additional domain controllers and your network connectivity is okay, these objects should automatically appear just like the way they appeared for us in this lab in Active Directory sites and services. This basically ensures that things are going exactly as planned, and you're not creating objects when the Active Directory does not recognize it, and then you're trying to force things to happen. Obviously there is some network problem that is preventing this from happening, and you're better off checking that problem and fixing it. So going back over here, you need to move a domain control object into the site, and then for each site designate a site license server. So at this point what has happened is the following. Going back over here to our network diagram, our domain now knows that there are two domain controllers in the California site, there is one domain controller in the North Carolina site, and then all the network clients on each location will try to use the services on DC1 and DC2 first if they are on California, and they'll try to use the services on DC3 if they're on the North Carolina site. In other words, our logical domain, benandbrady.com, and our physical network, and there are two subnets in that, 201.0 and 202.0, now are in sync. The two of them are going to work in sync and provide the most efficient network operations for us. Now, after doing all this, I think it's very important to verify that, let's not exit out of this, that our domain is still replicating. Because we made major changes out here, we still have to make sure that we can create a user object and actually replicate it across the domain. So in order to do that, let's do the following. What I'm going to do is minimize this. And then on DC1, we're still on DC1, let's go and create a new user object. And I'm going to go to Active Directory Users and Computers. And now what we're going to do is create a new user object. And then we'll try to replicate that user object across the network. So what we will do is create a new user object right here in the users link. I'm going to click on new user, and our user is going to be called Michelle Wang, and the logon name will be M Wang. I'm going to set up a password. Okay, we don't want to change the password when she logs in, and then click on finish. I just created a user object on DC1. I'm going to minimize this now, or rather let's close Active Directory, we don't need that anymore. And now let's go back to Active Directory Sites and Services, and let's go ahead and replicate our domain. So we're going to go to DC1 and then select this and right click and say replicate. See this? One or more of these Active Directory connections are between domain controllers in different sites. Active Directory will attempt to replicate across these connections. That is great. We never saw this before simply because DC1 and DC3 were physically being treated like they're in the same LAN. Okay? And I wanted to make sure that you understand that there are two different sites and replication is now going to take place, and we'll be covering it, I'll be covering this in much more detail in the next video, what is known as inter-site. It is going between California site and the North Carolina site, and that's why I'm seeing this message. Click on OK. Now we're attempting to replicate from DC2 to DC1, and if I replicate now, I will not see that message that I saw before. So you can see over here that our domain, benandbrady.com, and the Active Directory now can differentiate between these objects. They're not exactly the same. Same thing over here. Let's go ahead and replicate. And now again, I'm going from DC2. Let's go down a little bit over here. DC2 to DC3, or rather from DC3 to DC2, and I'll see the same thing over here. Over here, both of my objects are on the other side, so I should see that message both times. There we go. All right. So everything is taking place exactly as expected. And even though the messages were good, we still need to go and verify in each of these domains whether the object Michelle Wang actually showed up. So let's do that. I'm going to minimize all these screens. And now we'll start our connection to, I just have one connection on at this point, DC1. Let's go and connect to DC2. And remember, the good old router is making all this possible. So as you're doing these labs, and you may be performing these labs over an extended period of time, make sure that you always ping between these computers and ensure that the router is working, because if the router stops working, whatever I'm doing over here is actually going to stop. Remember, all these packets are going from DC1, DC2 to DC3 through the router. So at this point we are on DC2. Let's verify this. I'm going to go to Active Directory, Users and Computers. And over here we'll hope to find Michelle Wang's user account. Okay, there she is. Alrighty, and now going back to DC3. There we go, the distinct color of DC3. let's see if the replication actually took place between the two sites. An inter-site replication is a little bit different from within the same site or intra-site. It may take a little bit longer, but let's see if it actually shows up. If not, well, there we go. We didn't have to worry about anything. Otherwise, I would have just pushed it one more time or minimize the screen and then go back there a few minutes later to show you that the user actually moved from one location to another or from one domain controller to another. So at this point, you can go to any of the domain controllers, DC1, DC2, DC3. They are in different sites, and you should be able to create any object in the Active Directory. User was just an example of that, and that object will be replicated to all domain controllers. Now, how does this work? Let's say that Michelle actually is an employee in the California location, and usually when she's over here, she'll log into the domain and she gets authenticated over here. When she goes on, she's traveling this time, and she's in Charlotte, North Carolina. That day when she logs in, her user account will be authenticated from DC3 because the replication made sure that all the objects are over here, and then she was able to log in successfully through this. Otherwise, what would happen is that all your Active Directory traffic would cross the slow WAN connection, that is a T1 connection. Remember, there's a tremendous difference in the speed. Your network, your LAN is working at 100 megabits per second, whereas the WAN, the wide area network at T1 connection, which is considered great, is working at 1.54 megabits per second. So there's a huge difference in speed between the two, about 6 to 7 times the difference. And her user account will get authenticated over here. So this is what we have proved, is that our physical network and our logical domain, benandbrady.com, now are in sync with each other. That should also conclude this video. In this video, I showed you how to create site objects, create subnets, associate site with subnets, designate a licensing server, and finally, we replicated our domain across the 3 domain controllers. I thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you very soon in a different video in Active Directory.